Good day, my fellow board game enthusiast, and welcome to part 3 of the Aeon's End lore series. Starting with this part, which will cover the Legacy expansion, the game takes a drastic shift in how it delivers its lore. No longer do we need to scavenge around cards for pieces of a broken puzzle or scroll through massive Kickstarter pages to uncover developer stories. Instead, we are given the lavish buffet of a fully detailed campaign story. As such, I'll largely just be retelling the story you likely already know from playing the game, though in a slightly more cinematic fashion, and with any added details I've come across. Now, without further ado, let the Legacy begin. Following the events of War Eternal, we find our Breach Mages once again enjoying a few years of peace, free from any nameless attacks. In this joyous time, people have begun celebrating the achievements of the Breach Mages and idolize some of them as heroes. In particular, there was Brahma, the wisest of the mages, Desmodia, the master of great magic, Mist, the tactical genius, and Maelstrom, the magical craftsman. Even Zaxos, notorious for being rebellious, powerful, and reckless as we saw previously, had gained some renown. Now, despite not being swarmed by Nameless anymore, Brahma, remaining ever vigilant, relentlessly continued to train the next generation of Breach Mages. The latest group of young apprentices, played by the players in the game, were especially promising and ready to undertake their ordeal. That survive on your own in the deep dark caves right that Indira undertook in the previous part. On the morning of the big day of their ordeal, the apprentices were awoken in a most unexpected manner. The barracks doors were loudly flung open as Brahma and Mist carried a wounded Zaxos inside and laid him down on an empty bed. They berated Zaxos, stating that he had doomed them all. Before the apprentices could ask for more details, alarm bells rang, an earthquake hits the building and explosions can be heard in the distance. Brahma and Mist, with grave looks on their faces, rush out to defend Gravehold. The apprentices, not really knowing what was happening, follow the two in order to help in any way they could. Outside the barracks, Gravehold is burning and screams fill the air. Up above, the cave is illuminated by the largest void breach anyone has ever seen. From the void, Maelstrom emerges, accompanied by an endless swarm of bladed minions. Nobody knew where Maelstrom came from or how it appeared so suddenly, but clearly it was the result of one of Zaxos' failed experiments in his search to understand the nature of breaches. Like Zaxos, my dude, I get you mean well, but accidentally unleashing a Nameless by playing with power beyond your control wasn't a big enough warning sign the first time. You just had to go and mess things up a second time? Anyways, Maelstroms and its minions were unlike anything Gravehold had previously encountered. Breach Mages were dropping like flies as the enemy's bladed forces cut them apart. Only the likes of Desmodia and Maelstrom were able to hold the line, but they too were slowly getting overwhelmed. Even Brahma quickly became injured and had to fall back. She joined up with the apprentices and instructed them to focus on the minions, so as to creating openings for the experienced Breach Mages to fight the Nameless. Back in the center of the battle, Mist, wielding powers unknown, unleashes a mighty lava tendril that strikes Maelstrom hard enough to crack its outer shell. Desmodia quickly follows this up with her own mighty wave of light. Though these attacks injured Maelstrom, the Nameless did not show any signs of slowing down and launched a counterattack of its own. It crashed through buildings with an unstoppable force. The mages managed to avoid the brunt of this assault, but the ensuing debris inflicted a grave injury upon Maelstrom, essentially knocking him out of the battle. Sliding in as if to replace his wounded comrade, Zaxos suddenly appears and unleashes a shadowy attack of his own on Maelstrom. However, Zaxos had not yet fully recovered from his initial wounds, and attack drained him of the last of his strength. He muttered something about being able to fix the situation before retreating into a breach of his own. Seeing the situation worsen, Desmodia starts channeling her most powerful spell, urging the other mages to hold the Nameless off for just a few more moments. Mist takes to the front once more and unleashes a flaming inferno upon Maelstrom, while Brahma heals the apprentices so they too can provide one final push. Seconds feel like hours as both mages and apprentices struggle to hold the Nameless back. Then at last the moment arrives. Now radiating brightly, Desmodia rises in the air. She gives a solemn look back at her fellow mages, thanking them and asking them to take care of Gravehold, before unleashing all of her stored energy in a violent flash of light. Immediately the world begins to crumble. Rocks falls from the ceiling as buildings tumble. The group of apprentices can barely move under the intense gravitational forces. Mist arrives to shield them with a barrier, but they soon pass out nonetheless. When next the apprentices awoke, they realized that the world they knew is no more. Gravehold is gone. Lost beneath the rubble along with most of its people and mages, including Desmodia herself. Fortunately, the attack appeared to have worked as no sign nor stir of Maelstrom remained. But the price to pay was exceedingly high. Only a handful of survivors remained. Amongst them were Mist and Maelstrom, who tended to the wounded. Brahma also still lived, and insisted to continue training the apprentices for whatever may lie ahead. Once their training had progressed sufficiently, the apprentices joined the other breach mages in the search for more survivors. The search yielded a small group of citizens along with the discovery of a long-forgotten tunnel. Gravehold was now no longer a city, it was the stalwart people who continued to march on through the darkness. And march through these new tunnels they did, and right into an ambush. Bladius, lieutenant of Maelstrom's army, had also made it out alive. It was a minion bred for battle, encased in sharp edges and blades. It had likely sought out Gravehold's survivors to ensure their total eradication in the place of its master. Mist and the other breach mages were still recovering from the previous fight, and thus it fell to the apprentices to step up to the challenge. The apprentices and Bladius fought toe-to-toe, ultimately ending in the mages' victory. You might think the apprentices would celebrate their first big win on their own, but instead the realization sunk in that who they defeated was not a powerful Nameless, but a mere minion. Not getting disheartened, they took up training with Brahma once more to further develop their powers. Meanwhile, Mist scouted ahead, making a startling discovery. The tunnel they had been traveling in had led right to the surface. Now, as mentioned in part 1 of this video series, the tunnel from the surface to Gravehold was supposed to have been permanently sealed after the people fled from the very first Nameless attack. Though it's never stated, I believe the tunnel being accessible now is in large part thanks to the actions of the breach mage Jana, who believed the surface to be their salvation and had been slowly unsealing the tunnel in secret for years. Even if she didn't unseal it completely, the explosive earthquakes caused in the battle against Maelstrom likely did the rest of the work. Unfortunately, Jana is currently MIA, so I guess we'll never truly know. Mist quickly returned and brought everyone up the rest of the way. For all except Brahma, this was the first they had ever seen sky and endlessly stretching land. Even so, what they saw amazed them all. They expected to find a world in burning devastation, but instead they were greeted to lush grassy fields, trees, and rivers. Jana was right all along. The surface was indeed the paradise they had always longed to live in. Now it was simply up to the citizens to establish their new city, which would of course be no easy task for such a small group of people. While building was underway, the apprentices continued their training, this time under the guide of Maelstrom. Maelstrom stated that he had discovered some sort of breeding ground, containing pods that he could turn into weapons. He was about to send the apprentices on an expedition to retrieve these pods when a strange breach suddenly appeared. From it, Zaxos, who had not been seen since he disappeared mid-Maelstrom battle, emerges fully healed and seemingly stronger than ever. He boldly announces that finally figured out how to tap into and control the powers of the breaches created by the Nameless. Zaxos expected to be greeted with cheers for his discovery, but instead was only greeted by Mist's fist as she punched him square in the face. She fiercely screamed at Zaxos and rightfully blamed him for the destruction of Gravehold. Maelstrom had to drag Mist away to prevent her from bludgeoning Zaxos to death. The other breach mages looked at Zaxos with equal disgust, causing him to sulk away. With no further interruption, the Breach Mage apprentices set out on their journey to retrieve some pods. At the pod breeding ground, they encountered an ancient nameless, the spawning horror, who had rested on the surface so long its body became part of the very ground. It was the spawning horror that had created the pods and used the creatures within to nourish itself and serve at its behest. As such, this nameless was unaccustomed to fighting, but it was a full-fledged nameless nonetheless and provided a bigger challenge for the ever-growing apprentices. Upon its eventual defeat, the apprentices closed the breach the spawning horror had created to summon more minions. With nothing else standing in their way, the apprentices harvested the pods, bringing carts full of it back to the new settlement. The citizens were all overjoyed at the outcome of the expedition. All except for Zaxos, that is. He complained that he could have used the spawning horror's breach as a power source to protect everyone. Brahma, ever the traditionalist, would have none of it and maintained breach mages should only rely on their own breach magic. Seeing that he would gain no support, Zaxos stormed off into the strange void breach he created once more. No one paid his actions any mind though, and resumed their daily lives of building up a new future. It took a week for Maelstrom to finish converting the pods into weapons, but they proved to be as powerful as he envisioned them to be. Most of these weapons went to the apprentices, who had now become the settlement's main defense force. As the weeks passed, rumors began to spread that other breach mages had survived Gravehold's destruction. Paying heed to these rumors, Brahma, Mist, and a couple of scouts set out on an expedition together so they may regroup with their fellow people. Night had barely fallen when Mist returned to the camp, now bloodied and alone. She claimed that they were ambushed by a nameless that could take control of your mind, and that it had captured Brahma with its spores. Maelstrom began to treat Mist's wounds while instructing the apprentices to immediately set out on a rescue mission. It didn't take them long to reach the site of the ambush, and what a bloody sight it was. Towering above the field of blood grew the fungal mesh, and at its roots lied the remains of the scout who had been brainwashed and forced to fight one another. Enraged, the apprentices engaged the nameless in a fierce battle. About halfway through the fight, the fungal mesh shifted some of its roots, revealing a still breathing but heavily infested Brahma. Fortunately, the nameless didn't use its mind control to force Brahma to fight, but instead used her powers to continuously heal itself, prolonging the difficult encounter. Yet even this was not enough to save it from the wrath of the apprentices, who stood victorious that night. As the fungal mesh fell, Brahma became free from its control. The apprentices carried the weakened Brahma back to camp, where she vows in gratitude to share more of her arcane knowledge once she has recovered. In the meantime, Mist located the other survivors who had established a settlement of their own. Supply lines were soon created between the two settlements as they traded both knowledge and resources. At around this point, the settlement containing Brahma and the gang officially became known as New Gravehold. Now, and this is purely speculation on my part, but judging by past and future events, I believe the second settlement of survivors belonged to Yin Magda and her followers. It was previously established that Yin Magda possessed the ability to travel through the void, so much like Zaxos, she could have escaped Gravehold's collapse by opening and traveling through a breach. Additionally, we know Yin and Brahma really don't get along, so that would help explain why they keep the settlements separate rather than grouping together. One particularly dark night, a fog rolled towards New Gravehold. This was no ordinary fog, but instead a form of camouflage used by the Haze Fiend Nameless. A fact no one realized until it was already too late. By the time the alarm bells rang, the Haze Fiend had already snuffed out many lives and arrived at the tent of the apprentice mages, thinking them to be its next easy prey. However, the apprentice mages had grown strong enough to put up a fierce resistance. In the midst of the conflict, Zaxos also reappeared, shouting a warning that the Nameless have begun to seek out New Gravehold in order to destroy it. While his warning might have been late, his assistance came right on time as he helped the apprentices to finish off the Nameless. With the battle concluded and new Gravehold trying to pick itself up from despair once more, Zaxos revealed that his warning had not been referring only to the Haze Fiend, but also to Maelstrom, which had apparently survived the collapse of Gravehold and was now slowly burrowing its way to the surface. Zaxos pleaded with Brahma again to let him use the breach left by the Haze Fiend as a form of defense. To no one's surprise, Brahma denied his pleas and closed the breach herself. I have to give it to Zaxos, he is unrelenting in his quest for forbidden power if nothing else. But a man can only take so much rejection, and Zaxos had reached his limit. In a fit of rage, he unleashed a burst of lightning before disappearing back into the void. With the news of Maelstrom's inevitable return, Maelstrom sought out new materials to enhance the apprentice's weapons even further. Good news, he found a strange and powerful ore pretty quickly. Bad news, it was guarded by a terrible nameless called Deathmind. I don't know about you, but to me Deathmind sounds like the most metal name ever. Deathmind. Anyways, this nameless was particularly vicious in that it wiped the minds of all who faced it, erasing their knowledge and abilities. After careful consideration, Brahma came up with strategy that could give the apprentices a chance at victory. She would support them in battle and use her powers as a sort of beacon that could keep their memories alive. The plan worked like a charm, and the apprentices were able to quickly slay the Deathmind. It took some time to transport the ore recovered back to Gravehold, and even more time for Maelstrom to forge it into something useful. All the while the looming threat of Maelstrom drew ever closer. The fateful day arrives. Maelstrom had burst out of the ground and began floating menacingly towards New Gravehold. All the breach mages took up arms, ready to settle the score with their newly enhanced weapons and power at the ready. In a slow motion, Maelstrom began spinning, its large blades slicing towards the ground. Moments later, breaches opened below it as well, from which countless minions eagerly clawed their way out. The final battle had begun. An interesting tidbit for this fight: if the apprentices failed to finish off Bladius back near the start of the campaign, the minion now returns, though in a mostly injured state. One hard-fought battle and several flashy spells later, Maelstrom is defeated once and for all. Its shell cracks open as the Nameless crashes into the ground. From within, light stream out until its very core becomes visible, a twisted black void breach swirling inside. The entire city cheers at the sight of their victory as Brahma hugs her apprentices with pride. All that's left to do is for the apprentices to close the black breach, and we'll have concluded this tale. I guess that brings us to the end of this journey, and boy has it been a long one. No wonder they called this expansion a legacy campaign. Well, thanks for watching everyone, and I hope... Wait, is that boss music I hear? Zaxos approaches. Twisted and corrupted after drinking from the well of the void, he has ascended beyond the limits of a breach mage. Yet Zaxos' determination remained as single-minded and steadfast as before. He announces that he himself released Maelstrom to harvest its void core, and that no one would stand in his way from obtaining it any longer. The breach mages try their best to persuade their old comrade from the dark path he has chosen, but it is to no avail. They have no choice but to fight it out to the bitter end. Zaxos proved to be an even greater foe than any Nameless that came before him, wielding multiple breaches at the same time while summoning minions of his own. It took the combined efforts of Mist, Brahma, Maelstrom, and the apprentices to bring him down, but even defeated, his smoldering body would not relent. In a crippled state and covered with wounds, Zaxos continued to stumble towards the breach. As he reached out towards it, something reached back. A long black tendril extended out of the void, binding Zaxos and lifting him up before pulling him back into the void. The apprentices could only stare in shock as they saw Zaxos disappearing with a look of pure terror on his face. Shortly afterwards, the breach closes in on itself and disappears as well. Sunlight emerges from where the darkness once hovered, bringing with it a sense of warmth and security. Now the campaign really is over, though it does leave us with several unanswered questions. Where did Maelstrom come from? What became of Zaxos? Rest assured, my friends, all will be revealed in a future video. Bonus lore drop time. Despite providing a riveting story, the cards and Nameless in the Legacy campaign provide almost no additional information. This makes sense given how the mechanics of the campaign worked and that the players controlled self-insert mages, though as a lore hunter I still found it to be rather disappointing. As such, allow me to share the one bit of interesting flavor text I managed to uncover. On the relic card Geophage, it states Mist discovered a strange creature which she now keeps as her pet. She calls it Chompy. Now ain't that cute?